Part 1, Chapter 3 of Passing. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Passing by Nella Larsen. Part 1, Chapter 3. On Tuesday morning a dome of grey sky rose over the parched city, but the stifling air was not relieved by the silvery mist that seemed to hold a promise of rain, which did not fall. To Irene Redfield this soft foreboding fog was another reason for doing nothing about seeing Clare Kendry that afternoon. But she did see her. The telephone! For hours it had rung like something possessed. Since 9 o'clock she had been hearing its insistent jangle. A while she was resolute, saying firmly each time, "Not in, Liza. Take the message." And each time the servant returned with the information, "It's the same lady, ma'am. She says she'll call again." But at noon, her nerves frayed and her conscience smiting her at the reproachful look on Liza's ebony face as she withdrew for another denial, Irene weakened. "Oh, never mind. I'll answer this time, Liza." "It's her again." "Hello? Yes?" "It's Clare. 'Rene. Where have you been? Can you be here around 4? What? Oh, but 'Rene, you promised. Just for a little while. You can if you want to. I am so disappointed. I had counted so on seeing you. Oh, please be nice and come. Only for a minute. I'm sure you can manage it if you try. I won't beg you to stay. Yes. I'm going to expect you. It's the Morgan. Oh, yes, the name's Bellew, Mrs. John Bellew. About 4, then. I'll be so happy to see you. Goodbye." Damn! Irene hung up the receiver with an emphatic bang, her thoughts immediately filled with self-reproach. She'd done it again. Allowed Clare Kendry to persuade her into promising to do something for which she had neither time nor any special desire. What was it about Clare's voice that was so appealing, so very seductive? Clare met her in the hall with a kiss. She said, "You're good to come, 'Rene, but then you always were nice to me." And under her potent smile a part of Irene's annoyance with herself fled. She was even a little glad that she had come. Clare led the way, stepping lightly towards a room whose door was standing partly open, saying, "There's a surprise. It's a real party. See?" Entering, Irene found herself in a sitting-room, large and high, at whose windows hung startling blue draperies which triumphantly dragged attention from the gloomy chocolate-covered furniture, and Clare was wearing a thin floating dress of the same shade of blue, which suited her and the rather difficult room to perfection. For a minute Irene thought the room was empty, but turning her head she discovered, sunk deep in the cushions of a huge sofa, a woman staring up at her with such intense concentration that her eyelids were drawn as though the strain of that upward glance had paralyzed them. At first Irene took her to be a stranger, but in the next instant she said in an unsympathetic, almost harsh voice, "And how are you, Gertrude?" The woman nodded and forced a smile to her pouting lips. "I'm all right," she replied. "And you're just the same, Irene, not changed a bit." "Thank you," Irene responded as she chose a seat. She was thinking, "Great goodness, 2 of them." For Gertrude, too, had married a white man, though it couldn't be truthfully said that she was passing. Her husband, what was his name, had been in school with her and had been quite well aware, as had his family and most of his friends, that she was a Negro. It hadn't, Irene knew, seemed to matter to him then. Did it now, she wondered? Had Fred Martin, that was it, had he ever regretted his marriage because of Gertrude's race? Had Gertrude? Turning to Gertrude, Irene asked, "And Fred, how is he? It's unmentionable years since I've seen him." "Oh, he's all right," Gertrude answered briefly. For a full minute no one spoke. Finally, out of the oppressive little silence, Clare's voice came pleasantly, conversationally. "We'll have tea right away. I know that you can't stay long, 'Rene, and I'm so sorry you won't see Marjorie. We went up to the lake over the weekend to see some of Jack's people, just out of Milwaukee. Marjorie wanted to stay with the children. It seemed a shame not to let her, especially since it's so hot in town. But I'm expecting Jack any second." Irene said briefly, "That's nice." Gertrude remained silent. She was, it was plain, a little ill at ease. and her presence there annoyed Irene, roused in her a defensive and resentful feeling for which she had at the moment no explanation. But it did seem to her odd that the woman that Clare was now should have invited the woman that Gertrude was. Still, of course, Clare couldn't have known. 12 years since they had met. Later, when she examined her feeling of annoyance, Irene admitted, a shade reluctantly, that it arose from a feeling of being outnumbered, a sense of aloneness, in her adherence to her own class and kind, not merely in the great thing of marriage, but in the whole pattern of her life as well. Clare spoke again, this time at length. Her talk was of the change that Chicago presented to her after her long absence in European cities. Yes, she said in reply to some question from Gertrude, she'd been back to America a time or two, but only as far as New York and Philadelphia, and once she had spent a few days in Washington. John Bellew, who, it appeared, was some sort of international banking agent, hadn't particularly wanted her to come with him on this trip, but as soon as she had learned that it would probably take him as far as Chicago, she had made up her mind to come anyway. I simply had to, and after I once got here I was determined to see someone I knew and find out what had happened to everybody. I didn't quite see how I was going to manage it, but I meant to. Somehow. I'd just about decided to take a chance and go out to your house, 'Rene, or call up and arrange a meeting when I ran into you. What luck! Irene agreed that it was luck. It's the first time I've been home for 5 years, and now I'm about to leave. A week later and I'd have been gone. And how in the world did you find Gertrude? In the book. I remembered about Fred. His father still has the meat market. Oh, yes, said Irene, who had only remembered it as Clare had spoken. On Cottage Grove, near... Gertrude broke in. No, it's moved. We're on Maryland Avenue, used to be Jackson, now. Near 63rd Street. And the market's Fred's. His name's the same as his father's. Gertrude, Irene thought, looked as if her husband might be a butcher. There was left of her youthful prettiness, which had been so much admired in their high school days, no trace. She had grown broad, fat almost, and though there were no lines on her large white face, its very smoothness was somehow prematurely aging. Her black hair was clipped, and by some unfortunate means all the live curliness had gone from it. Her over-trimmed Georgette crepe dress was too short and showed an appalling amount of leg, stout legs in sleazy stockings of a vivid rose-beige shade. Her plump hands were newly and not too competently manicured, for the occasion probably. And she wasn't smoking. Clare said, and Irene fancied that her husky voice held a slight edge, "Before you came, Irene, Gertrude was telling me about her 2 boys. Twins. Think of it. Isn't it too marvellous for words?" Irene felt a warmness creeping into her cheeks. Uncanny, the way Clare could divine what one was thinking. She was a little put out, but her manner was entirely easy as she said, "That is nice. I've 2 boys myself, Gertrude. Not twins, though. It seems that Clare's rather behind, doesn't it?" Gertrude, however, wasn't sure that Clare hadn't the best of it. "She's got a girl. I wanted a girl. So did Fred." "Isn't that a bit unusual?" Irene asked. "Most men want sons. Egotism, I suppose." "Well, Fred didn't." The tea things had been placed on a low table at Clare's side. She gave them her attention now, pouring the rich amber fluid from the tall glass pitcher into stately slim glasses, which she handed to her guests, and then offered them lemon or cream, and tiny sandwiches or cakes. After taking up her own glass, she informed them, "No, I have no boys, and I don't think I'll ever have any. I'm afraid. I nearly died of terror the whole 9 months before Marjorie was born, for fear that she might be dark. Thank goodness she turned out all right. But I'll never risk it again, never. The strain is simply too hellish." Gertrude Martin nodded in complete comprehension. This time it was Irene who said nothing. "You don't have to tell me," Gertrude said fervently. "I know what it is all right. Maybe you don't think I wasn't scared to death too. Fred said I was silly, and so did his mother. But of course they thought it was just a notion I'd got into my head, and they blamed it on my condition. They don't know, like we do, how it might go way back and turn out dark, no matter what color the father and mother are." Perspiration stood out on her forehead. Her narrow eyes rolled first in Clare's, then in Irene's direction. As she talked, she waved her heavy hands about. "No," she went on, "no more for me either, not even a girl. It's awful the way it skips generations and then pops out. Why, he actually said he didn't care what color it turned out, if I would only stop worrying about it. But of course nobody wants a dark child." Her voice was earnest, and she took for granted that her audience was in entire agreement with her. Irene, whose head had gone up with a quick little jerk, now said in a voice of whose even tone she was proud, "One of my boys is dark." Gertrude jumped as if she had been shot at. Her eyes goggled. Her mouth flew open. She tried to speak, but could not immediately get the words out. Finally she managed to stammer, "Oh, and your husband, is he dark, too?" Irene, who was struggling with a flood of feelings, resentment, anger, and contempt, was, however, still able to answer as coolly as if she had not that sense of not belonging to and of despising the company in which she found herself drinking iced tea from tall amber glasses on that hot August afternoon. Her husband, she informed them quietly, couldn't exactly pass. At that reply Clare turned on Irene her seductive caressing smile, and remarked a little scoffingly, "I do think that coloured people, are too silly about some things. After all, the thing's not important to Irene or hundreds of others. Not awfully even to you, Gertrude. It's only deserters like me who have to be afraid of freaks of the nature. As my inestimable dad used to say, everything must be paid for. Now please one of you tell me whatever happened to Claude Jones. You know, the tall lanky specimen who used to wear that comical little moustache that the girls used to laugh at so, like a thin streak of soot. The moustache, I mean." At that Gertrude shrieked with laughter. "Claude Jones!" and launched into the story of how he was no longer a Negro or a Christian, but had become a Jew. "A Jew?" Clare exclaimed. "Yes, a Jew. A black Jew, he calls himself. He won't eat ham, and goes to the synagogue on Saturday. He's got a beard now as well as a moustache. You'd die laughing if you saw him. He's really too funny for words. Fred says he's crazy, and I guess he is. Oh, he's a scream all right. A regular scream." And she shrieked again. Clare's laugh tinkled out. "It certainly sounds funny enough. Still, it's his own business. If he gets along better by turning." At that Irene, who was still hugging her unhappy don't-care feeling of rightness, broke in, saying bitingly, "It evidently doesn't occur to either you or Gertrude that he might possibly be sincere in changing his religion. Surely everyone doesn't do everything for gain." Clare Kendry had no need to search for the full meaning of that utterance. She reddened slightly and retorted seriously, "Yes, I admit that might be possible, his being sincere, I mean. It just didn't happen to occur to me, that's all. I'm surprised." And the seriousness changed to mockery. "That you should have expected it to. Or did you really?" "You don't, I'm sure, imagine that that is a question that I can answer," Irene told her. "Not here and now." Gertrude's face expressed complete bewilderment. However, seeing that little smiles had come out on the faces of the two other women, and not recognizing them for the smiles of mutual reservations, which they were, she smiled too. Clare began to talk, steering carefully away from anything that might lead towards race or other thorny subjects. It was the most brilliant exhibition of conversational weight-lifting that Irene had ever seen. Her words swept over them in charming, well-modulated streams. Her laughs tinkled and pealed. Her little stories sparkled. Irene contributed a bare yes or no here and there. Gertrude a "You don't say!" less frequently. For a while the illusion of general conversation was nearly perfect. Irene felt her resentment changing gradually to a silent, somewhat grudging admiration. Clare talked on, her voice, her gestures, colouring all she said of wartime in France, of after the wartime in Germany, of the excitement at the time of the general strike in England, of dressmakers' openings in Paris, of the new gaiety of Budapest. But it couldn't last, this verbal feat. Gertrude shifted in her seat and fell to fidgeting with her fingers. Irene, bored at last by all this repetition of the self-same things that she had read too often in papers, magazines, and books, set down her glass and collected her bag and handkerchief. She was smoothing out the tan fingers of her gloves, preparatory to putting them on, when she heard the sound of the outer door being opened, and saw Clare spring up with an expression of relief, saying, "How lovely! Here's Jack at exactly the right minute. You can't go now, 'Rene dear." John Bellew came into the room. The first thing that Irene noticed about him was that he was not the man that she had seen with Clare Kendry on the Drayton roof. This man, Clare's husband, was a tallish person, broadly made. His age she guessed to be somewhere between 35 and 40. His hair was dark brown and waving, and he had a soft mouth, somewhat womanish, set in an unhealthy-looking, dough-coloured face. His steel-grey opaque eyes were very much alive, moving ceaselessly between thick bluish lids. But there was, Irene decided, nothing unusual about him, unless it was an impression of latent physical power. "Hello, Nig," was his greeting to Clare. Gertrude, who had started slightly, settled back and looked covertly towards Irene, who had caught her lip between her teeth and sat gazing at husband and wife. It was hard to believe that even Clare Kendry would permit this ridiculing of her race by an outsider, though he chanced to be her husband. So he knew, then, that Clare was a Negro. From her talk the other day, Irene had understood that he didn't. But how rude, how positively insulting for him to address her in that way in the presence of guests! In Clare's eyes, as she presented her husband, was a queer gleam, a jeer, it might be. Irene couldn't define it. The mechanical professions that attend an introduction over, she inquired, "Did you hear what Jack called me?" "Yes," Gertrude answered, laughing with a dutiful eagerness. Irene didn't speak. Her gaze remained level on Clare's smiling face. The black eyes fluttered down. "Tell them, dear, why you call me that." The man chuckled, crinkling up his eyes, not, Irene was compelled to acknowledge, unpleasantly. He explained, "Well, you see, it's like this. When we were first married, she was as white well, white as a lily. But I declare she's getting darker and darker. I tell her if she don't look out, she'll wake up one of these days and find she's turned into a nigger." He roared with laughter. Clare's ringing bell-like laugh joined his. Gertrude, after another uneasy shift in her seat, added her shrill one. Irene, who had been sitting with lips tightly compressed, cried out, "That's good!" and gave way to gales of laughter. She laughed and laughed and laughed. Tears ran down her cheeks, her sides ached, her throat hurt. She laughed on and on and on, long after the others had subsided, until, catching sight of Clare's face, the need for a more quiet enjoyment of this priceless joke, and for caution, struck her. At once she stopped. Clare handed her husband his tea, and laid her hand on his arm with an affectionate little gesture. Speaking with confidence as well as with amusement, she said, "My goodness, Jack, what difference would it make if, after all these years, you were to find out that I was 1 or 2% coloured?" Bellew put out his hand in a repudiating fling, definite and final. "Oh no, Nig," he declared. "Nothing like that with me. I know you're no nigger, so it's all right. You can get as black as you please as far as I'm concerned, since I know you're no nigger. I draw the line at that. No niggers in my family. Never have been and never will be." Irene's lips trembled almost uncontrollably, but she made a desperate effort to fight back her disastrous desire to laugh again, and succeeded. Carefully selecting a cigarette from the lacquered box on the tea-table before her, she turned an oblique look on Clare, and encountered her peculiar eyes fixed on her with an expression so dark and deep and unfathomable that she had for a short moment the sensation of gazing into the eyes of some creature utterly strange and apart. A faint sense of danger brushed her, like the breath of a cold fog. Absurd, her reason told her, as she accepted Bellew's proffered light for her cigarette. Another glance at Clare showed her smiling. So, as one always ready to oblige, was Gertrude. An onlooker, Irene reflected, would have thought it a most congenial tea-party, all smiles and jokes and hilarious laughter. She said humorously, "So you dislike Negroes, Mr. Bellew?" But her amusement was at her thought rather than her words. John Bellew gave a short denying laugh. "You got me wrong there, Mrs. Redfield. Nothing like that at all. I don't dislike them. I hate them. And so does Nig, for all she's trying to turn into one. She wouldn't have a nigger made around her for love nor money. Not that I'd want her to. They give me the creeps, the black scrimey devils." This wasn't funny. Had Bellew, Irene inquired, ever known any Negroes? The defensive tone of her voice brought another start from the uncomfortable Gertrude, and for all her appearance of serenity, a quick apprehensive look from Clare. Bellew answered, "Thank the Lord, no, and never expect to. But I know people who've known them, better than they know their black selves, and I read in the papers about them, always robbing and killing people. And," he added darkly, "worse." From Gertrude's direction came a queer little suppressed sound, a snort or a giggle. Irene couldn't tell which. There was a brief silence, during which she feared that her self-control was about to prove too frail a bridge to support her mounting anger and indignation. She had a leaping desire to shout at the man beside her. "And you're sitting here surrounded by 3 black devils, drinking tea." The impulse passed, obliterated by her consciousness of the danger in which such rashness would involve Clare, who remarked with a gentle reprovingness: "Jack, dear, I'm sure 'Rene doesn't care to hear all about your pet aversions, nor Gertrude either. Maybe they read the papers too, you know." She smiled on him, and her smile seemed to transform him, to soften and mellow him, as the rays of the sun does a fruit. "All right, Nig, old girl, I'm sorry," he apologized. Reaching over, he playfully touched his wife's pale hands, then turned back to Irene. "Didn't mean to bore you, Mrs. Redfield. Hope you'll excuse me," he said sheepishly. "Clare tells me you're living in New York. Great city, New York. The city of the future." In Irene, rage had not retreated, but was held by some dam of caution and allegiance to Clare. So in the best casual voice she could muster, she agreed with Bellew. Though, she reminded him, it was exactly what Chicagoans were apt to say of their city. And all the while she was speaking, she was thinking how amazing it was that her voice did not tremble, that outwardly she was calm. Only her hands shook slightly. She drew them inward from their rest in her lap, and pressed the tips of her fingers together to still them. "Husband's a doctor, I understand. Manhattan or one of the other boroughs?" Manhattan, Irene informed him, and explained the need for Brian to be within easy reach of certain hospitals and clinics. "Interesting life, a doctor's." "Yes. Hard, though, and in a way monotonous. Nerve-wracking, too." "Hard on the wife's nerves, at least, eh? So many lady patients." He laughed, enjoying with a boyish heartiness the hoary joke. Irene managed a momentary smile, but her voice was sober as she said: "Brian doesn't care for ladies, especially sick ones. I sometimes wish he did. It's South America that attracts him." "Coming place, South America. If they ever get the niggers out of it. It's run over." "Really, Jack?" Clare's voice was on the edge of temper. "Honestly, Nig, I forgot." To the others he said: "You see how henpecked I am." And to Gertrude: "You're still in Chicago, Mrs. Martin?" He was, it was plain, doing his best to be agreeable to these old friends of Clare's. Irene had to concede that under other conditions she might have liked him. A fairly good-looking man of amiable disposition, evidently, and in easy circumstances, plain and with no nonsense about him. Gertrude replied that Chicago was good enough for her. She'd never been out of it, and didn't think she ever should. Her husband's business was there. Of course. Can't jump up and leave a business." There followed a smooth surface of talk about Chicago, New York, their differences, and their recent spectacular changes. It was, Irene thought, unbelievable and astonishing that 4 people could sit so unruffled, so ostensibly friendly, while they were in reality seething with anger, mortification, shame. But no, on second thought she was forced to amend her opinion. John Bellew most certainly was as undisturbed within as without. So perhaps was Gertrude Martin. At least she hadn't the mortification and shame that Clare Kendry must be feeling, or in such full measure the rage and rebellion that she, Irene, was repressing. "More tea, Irene?" Clare offered. "Thanks, no. And I must be going. I'm leaving tomorrow, you know, and I've still got packing to do." She stood up. So did Gertrude and Clare and John Bellew. "How do you like the Drayton, Mrs. Redfield?" the latter asked. "The Drayton? Oh, very much indeed," Irene answered, her scornful eyes on Clare's unrevealing face. "Nice place, all right. Stayed there a time or two myself," the man informed her. "Yes, it is nice," Irene agreed. "Almost as good as our best New York places." She had withdrawn her look from Clare and was searching in her bag for some non-existent something. Her understanding was rapidly increasing, as was her pity and her contempt. Clare was so daring, so lovely, and so having. They gave their hands to Clare with appropriate murmurs. "So good to have seen you. I do hope I'll see you again soon." "Good-bye," Clare returned. "It was good of you to come, 'Rene dear, and you too, Gertrude." "Good-bye, Mr. Bellew." "So glad to have met you." It was Gertrude who said that. Irene couldn't, she absolutely couldn't bring herself to utter the polite fiction or anything approaching it. He accompanied them out into the hall, summoned the elevator. "Good-bye," they said again, stepping in. Plunging downward, they were silent. They made their way through the lobby without speaking. but as soon as they had reached the street, Gertrude, in the manner of one unable to keep bottled up for another minute that which for the last hour she had had to retain, burst out, "My God! What an awful chance! She must be plumb crazy!" "Yes, it certainly seems risky," Irene admitted. "Risky? I should say it was. Risky! My God! What a word! And the mess she's liable to get herself into. Still, I imagine she's pretty safe. They don't live here, you know, and there's a child. That's a certain security." "It's an awful chance, just the same," Gertrude insisted. "I'd never in the world have married Fred without him knowing. You can't tell what will turn up." "Yes, I do agree that it's safer to tell, but then Bellew wouldn't have married her, and after all, that's what she wanted." Gertrude shook her head. "I wouldn't be in her shoes for all the money she's getting out of it when he finds out. Not with him feeling the way he does. Gee, wasn't it awful? For a minute I was so mad I could have slapped him." It had been, Irene acknowledged, a distinctly trying experience, as well as a very unpleasant one. "I was more than a little angry myself." "And imagine her not telling us about him feeling that way. Anything might have happened. We might have said something." That, Irene pointed out, was exactly like Clare Kendry, taking a chance and not at all considering anyone else's feelings. Gertrude said, "Maybe she thought we'd think it a good joke. And I guess you did, the way you laughed. My land, I was scared to death he might catch on." "Well, it was rather a joke," Irene told her. "On him and us, and maybe on her." "All the same, it's an awful chance. I'd hate to be her." "She seems satisfied enough. She's got what she wanted, and the other day she told me it was worth it." But about that Gertrude was sceptical. "She'll find out different," was her verdict. "She'll find out different, all right." Rain had begun to fall, a few scattered large drops. The end of the day crowds were scurrying in the directions of streetcars and elevated roads. Irene said, "You're going south? I'm sorry, I've got an errand. If you don't mind, I'll just say good-bye here. It's been nice seeing you, Gertrude. Say hello to Fred for me, and to your mother if she remembers me. Good-bye." She had wanted to be free of the other woman, to be alone, for she was still sore and angry. What right, she kept demanding of herself, had Clare Kendry to expose her, or even Gertrude Martin, to such humiliation, such downright insult? And all the while, on the rushing ride out to her father's house, Irene Redfield was trying to understand the look on Clare's face as she had said good-bye. Partly mocking, it had seemed, and partly menacing, and something else for which she could find no name. For an instant a recrudescence of that sensation of fear which she had had while looking into Clare's eyes that afternoon touched her. A slight shiver ran over her. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Just somebody walking over my grave, as the children say." She tried a tiny laugh, and was annoyed to find that it was close to tears. What a state she had allowed that horrible Bellew to get her into! And late that night even, long after the last guest had gone and the old house was quiet, she stood at her window frowning out into the dark rain and puzzling again over that look on Clare's incredibly beautiful face. She couldn't, however, come to any conclusion about its meaning, try as she might. It was unfathomable, utterly beyond any experience or comprehension of hers. She turned away from the window, at last, with a still deeper frown. Why, after all, worry about Clare Kendry? She was well able to take care of herself, had always been able. And there were, for Irene, other things, more personal and more important to worry about. Besides, her reason told her, she had only herself to blame for her disagreeable afternoon and its attendant fears and questions. She ought never to have gone. End of chapter 3.